I was gonna send it to Sherb to see if she would be pissed, but I never. She did a little bit of that writing
Yeah.
for people's.
Yeah.
Welcome, folks coming in. We're going to get started in a few minutes. Glad to have you here. Thanks, folks, for joining. Just like waiting a few more minutes and then we'll get started. Okay, well, I'm going to get us started. I know some more people might be trickling in, which we'll welcome. But I know there's so much we want to talk about today with our amazing guest speakers. So I'm going to get us started. Welcome to this edition of Voice of Witnesses Storytelling and Practice event series. This is something we've done in the past. This is our first event for the fall, which we're really excited about, focused on history, memory, and the environment. Just a few norms as we get started. We are recording this webinar just to give everyone a heads up. And so everyone who's registered will get a link to the Zoom recording when we do a follow-up email, which will also include any, links or resources we talk about. So if you do have to head out early or have to step out, we will have the full video for you to review afterwards. If anyone needs automated captioning, feel free to use that. It should be at the bottom of your Zoom window in the toolbar. Feel free to message me if you have any trouble accessing that. And we'd love for people to introduce themselves in the chat. You could share your name, where you're located, a land acknowledgement with a helpful website there, native-land.ca, if you're not sure whose Indigenous land you're on, any affiliations that you're with, whether organizations or schools, and anything else you'd like to share. Feel free to use the chat box throughout the workshop if you want to ask questions or share, reflections or thoughts you're having. We're also a smaller group today, so you can also do the raise hand feature, or I think just unmute and share, because we want this to be a really active, engaging space for everybody. And we're also going to have time for questions at the end. Great. So I know a lot of folks probably in the chat know about Voice of Witness and who we are, but just in case some folks are new to us, we're really glad you're finding out about our organization. So we are Voice of Witness, also known by our initials, VOW, and we are an oral history organization founded about 15 years ago in San Francisco, though now we're national across the country. And our focus is to really use the power of storytelling, first-person storytelling, especially to advance human rights. And we do this this by amplifying the stories of people who are directly impacted, as well as fighting against injustice. So we really believe in the power, the transformative power of storytelling, and that it's so important to amplify and highlight first-person stories from people who've been directly impacted by different social justice issues, really a chance to flip the script where people who have lived experience in these different issues like migration, displacement, the criminal justice system, climate crisis, really passing the mic so that their voices can be heard. We have an oral history book series that has anchored our organization. We have over 22 books in our series now. Each book focuses on a specific social justice issue and includes life histories of people who've been impacted by those issues. We call those folks our narrators, trying to be really thoughtful of language that affirms their agency and their generosity in sharing their stories with us. We also have an education program where we bring these stories and oral history storytelling resources to classrooms all across the country, in a community partnership program where we work with other nonprofits who are doing direct service on behalf of our narrator communities and connect on how storytelling and oral history can advance the advocacy purposes that they're working on. So that's all about Voice of Witness. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask more about what we do. We love hearing from people. We love working and partnering with people in different ways. We can definitely tailor our work to fit whatever needs your community might have. And just as, a primer on a Voice of Witness and oral history, oral history is such a dynamic tool that we found through our work. It's a way to, do storytelling in a very ethical, narrator-centered approach that really affirms, like I was saying, narrator agency, making sure it's not exploitative or extractive, sharing someone's story. And we really believe that it can connect to, promoting advocacy and narrative change on a number of social justice topics by really thinking about whose voice is being heard, whose voice isn't being heard, and how we can change that dynamic. It's a really powerful tool for education, to learn about issues, but also to support young people in sharing their own stories and having pride in their own voices. It's a great tool for building community and healing and connection. Just a really great way to build empathy and to connect and learn from one another. And this series is our Storytelling and Practice series, which we started, I think, a few years ago, which is just a really great chance to highlight some of the amazing work in our Voice of Witness larger community and network. It's a chance for us to work and to sit down and have a conversation with an individual storyteller. And we've worked with people who are oral historians, writers, filmmakers, artists, or a combination thereof, and a chance to learn about what is their practice like, how do they integrate elements of oral history and community-based storytelling, what are the things they're working on, what are challenges they've faced. Just a chance to really sit down and have an intimate conversation. And so this is the first one for this fall. We have a few more coming up in the next month or so. I'll be dropping links in the chat so people can hopefully reach out and register for those events. So my name is Ella Banerjee. I am the community partnership manager at Voice of Witness. I use she, her pronouns, calling from Ohlone land, also known as Berkeley, California. And I'm super excited to introduce our two speakers who are going to be the bulk of the conversation. I'll be muting myself pretty soon. But we're going to have a conversation between my amazing colleague, Fanny, and Lyndsie, who is an incredible oral historian and writer, among many other things. So it's my privilege to get to introduce them. So Fanny Garcia is the editorial manager at Voice of Witness, and she's also an independent oral historian working with immigration narratives. When she's not collaborating on and marking up manuscripts or teaching and scouting projects and partnerships, she's tending to her array of indoor plants, which I've seen and can attest that they're very beautiful. Fanny, do you want to say hi and share where you're calling from?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's storytelling and practice session. I'm really excited to speak with Lyndsie, and I'm based in Lenapehoking, which is now called Harlem, New York City.
Thanks, Fanny. And I'm very excited to introduce our storyteller in practice for this session, our very special guest speaker, Lyndsie Bourgon, who is a journalist, author, and oral historian. She is a National Geographic Explorer and a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society and Explorers Club. She has experience reporting and conducting fieldwork in rural areas, including Haida Gwa, the Peruvian Amazon, and the California Redwoods. And she writes for publications such as The Guardian, The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Walrus, and Canadian Geographic. Her book, Tree Thieves, Crime and Survival in North America's Woods, was nominated for the Penn John Kenneth Galbraith Award for Nonfiction, the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize at Columbia University, and a BC and Yukon Book Prize. As an oral historian, Lyndsie has conducted interviews and managed projects in the Shetland Islands, Odenwald Forest, and Indigenous communities in Northern Alberta, British Columbia, and Northern Ontario. So really excited to hear this conversation. I'm going to pass it now over to Fanny, who's going to be in conversation with Lyndsie to talk about today's topic. So thank you all so much.
Lyndsie, thank you so much for joining us. This conversation has been long in the making, and we finally made it to the day. Thank you. I'm really excited to talk to you about, and I'm going to use your words because I found them on your website. You say that your work is about the environment and its entanglement with history, culture, and identity. And I love that description. I'm going to ask you more about it later on. But first, say hello to our audience and tell us a little bit about yourself that we didn't mention in your bio.
Sure. Yeah. So, hi. I'm Lyndsie. I live in Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's Mi'kma'ki land. And I, along with thank you for reading out loud my bio. I currently am working as a professor at the University of King's College in the journalism school, which is also where I got my undergrad degree. So it has been a really exciting, busy autumn for me, kind of coming back home to this place. And yeah, that's what I've been up to for the past couple of months. And I'm really excited. Obviously, we're all excited, but I'm really excited to be here talking and to be sort of in the VOW ecosystem because I've been following the Voice of Witness works and books for years, really, and really admiring the approach and the sort of what's the word I'm thinking of? The kind of urgency of the work, really. I mean, it's oral history that VOW does, but I'm really interested in the fact that oral history is like very present and very past at the same time. So
Thank you so much, Lyndsie.
yeah.
So back to your description about your work. What I love about that description is that you center the environment as an active force shaping culture
Mhm.
and identity, and not just like as a backdrop to human beings or human stories or something that we act upon. So, and as I was thinking about it, you're basically asking how does the environment shape who we are, rather than only asking how do humans impact the environment. Do you think this is an accurate observation and or not? And what's your intention behind it?
Yeah, I think it's sort of like the observation of my my career thus far. I think when before I went to get my master's and really learned about oral history and got into it, I had been working as a freelance journalist for, since I graduated university and writing features, and I had, over that time really sort of whittled my interest down into realizing that what I was drawn to was narrative nonfiction and stories that really complicated our ideas of why people in a certain area had certain opinions and felt certain ways about the environment. And I when I lived in Western Canada for quite some time, I had gone to this regularly to this sort of writers retreat and film festival called the Banff Mountain Film Festival. And there was a kind of colleague writer of mine there who finally said one day, "I think what you like is environmental history." And I just was like, "Oh, I had no idea that this was a thing." And once I started really getting into it, I realized that there were all these undercurrents in my life and in stories that I heard about how the environment had really influenced and then also been influenced by people's identity. And so I grew up in ranching part of Canada, so just north of the Montana border. And that was often a place where I often really disagreed with a lot of maybe some political undercurrents or points of view. And I realized as I grew older and I was hearing more and more of these stories and putting things together that really the environment and that history of the environment really had influenced a lot of the perspectives around me when I was growing up, and that maybe I hadn't really understood at that time. And
Wow.
I've been that's through work and industry and environmentalism, as well as sort of like day-to-day living in kind of harsh environments or places where your job is really tied to the work that
Hmm.
you do and the money that you earn, and also who your family is and who your family's family is and how they came to be somewhere, and how we experience rules around the land. So it all just sort of came together for me and under that topic, and really realizing that I wanted to listen to people talk about that and make it really complicated.
Hmm.
Yeah.
How does your most recent book,
Uh-huh.
Tree Thieves, Crime and Survival in North America's Woods, how does it connect
Yeah.
to all that you've been?
Oh, yeah. So when that story, so in 2013, I read a news story on CBC, which is essentially sort of like NPR of Canada, and it was a little short news story at the top of the website that said like somebody in British Columbia stole an 800-year-old cedar tree from a park. And like I just told you, I'm from the prairies, and I was like, I didn't realize that, like, I didn't grow up around trees like that. So I was like, I did not realize that this was possible. And at the time, I was still freelancing, and I thought that I was going to follow this story and a make it a crime story of, like I kind of thought, oh, I'm going to write about this and it's going to be a narrative about rangers and bad guys and poachers and whatever. And that just very quickly got exploded the minute I started doing interviews and the minute I started actually trying to spend time in the communities where poaching was happening. And people were telling me how complicated it was, not just the motivations for their poaching, which were these kind of uh, sociocultural needs of like a community that had gone through deindustrialization and had not been supported at all on the other side of coming out of that. And so you have mass, increases in poverty and increases in substance use and things like that. But also just the identity that people felt with the forest around them, and the complicated, often very frustrated feelings they felt around what I would consider sort of top-down conservation from really quite iconic American institutions like the Forest Service and the National Park Service, and how we always hear about these as like kind of really wonderful examples of sort of North American ingenuity to conserve and bring these beautiful landscapes to life. And then very quickly, I was hearing people say like, well, they never talked to us about this, and they took this land away from us, and I felt that that was mine, and that is not being preserved for me. This is
Hmm.
being preserved for tourists. And
Hmm.
very quickly, I really kind of came to understand how communities had been sort of forged against the park as well as for the park. And it
Hmm.
really complicated uh, my view of what this entire story was and why people might steal trees. Yeah.
Yeah, I had never, until your book, I had never thought to understand the economic motivations for also poaching trees.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit or expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so in America and in Canada, there's actually like, there are certain trees that are going to be more high value than other trees. And in many cases, we have recognized that. And because of the deforestation that occurred due to mass logging and overlogging, we have placed those trees in sort of protective enclosures of parks or reserves or whatever terms you want to use. And actually, in doing that, we have also increased their monetary worth. So in a few ways, those trees have become more valuable.
Wow.
And at the same time, many of the small communities and maybe smaller cities that were once logging communities or mill towns around those parks lost their economies. And in a lot of instances, when those parks were put in, so Redwoods National Park, it was initially instated in 1960. It's been a while since I did the dates on this, so you can fact check me and I'll apologize, but
Okay.
1968. And then it was expanded in 1978. And when it was expanded, and what that was Forest Service land that was taken out of commission for logging and placed in this iconic national park, and then expanded yet again, more Forest Service land done, put aside. And at that time, the communities that surrounded those parks, they did not feel appropriately consulted. In many cases, they actually factually were consulted, but what ended up happening was that their perspectives were sort of bound in these really nice, like congressional records reports that you can see in libraries and put on a shelf and just like
Mhm.
we consulted you and we never listened to a single thing and we did what we were going to do. And they were promised maybe that tourism was going to help really kind of replace an economy of that it just simply tourism cannot replace of of industry. And we're now 40, 30 years out for some of that, and it's really become quite apparent that it has not worked.
Mhm.
And that the economy did not bounce back in a way that perhaps some people that live there now, that their dads or granddads or even further back were told that it would. And that has, there has been fostered a sort of anger that has come down through a few 2 to 3 generations to them. And in many cases, frankly, like a really fervent entitlement that this was promised to us. This was taken away from us by the government and by people that are not of our community. And we
Mhm.
were told something would happen that didn't happen. And now we're
Mhm.
very angry. And now you're justified in going in and poaching a redwood or poaching a cedar or a maple.
Wow.
Yeah. There's like really deep roots in that. I mean, I think you can Robin Hood, you can go all the way back to Robin Hood saying, I'm stealing from the rich, giving to the poor. Land was taken from us and it's put away for the king, and we can't use this anymore. And in America, where there are no kings, the government is the king. I hope that remains.
Yeah.
But th
Yeah.
this is like all very sort of underlying all of that is this sort of like deep, deep sort of resentment of class differences and of cultural differences under the surface that kind of bubble up into the environment in that way.
When you talk about a redwood or cedar, these are huge trees.
Yes. Yeah.
How do people steal them and poach them or take them
Mm.
away? It kind of
The
doesn't fit in my
cedar,
brain.
yeah, the cedar in BC, that was actually like a two-part operation, they think, or it may have even been a three, where they one night. There was actually a bit more of a complicated story, that one, where there are a lot of parks in Canada and in North America because our public service has been essentially gutted to a certain extent or comparatively, where rangers are not around all the time. And actually, for Redwoods National Park, that is a huge park. You couldn't have rangers on every path at all times. And so people that live in the community, they actually have come to really know the cycle of like who's on what day and where their rounds take them. And for the cedar in British Columbia, it is not that different. And there was nobody around over the span of time that the tree was brought down, or that, to be honest, in that case, the tree was kind of partially brought down. A ranger identified it. The rangers actually felled that tree because it was a danger. So they did the bulk of the work. And then the poachers returned and chopped it up and put it in trucks and removed it. Redwoods are different. Like in a lot of cases, actually, what's happening is that burls are being taken off the tree. And so burls are those big, kind of round growths that you might see off a tree trunk. And because redwoods are so big, those burls are massive. So you might
Mhm.
see one on an oak in your backyard and it's like kind of a nice little thing, but
Mhm.
these are huge, and people will just go in and shave them off and cut them off and sell that wood to shops.
Wow.
Or sometimes if a redwood has fallen in one way or another, people will transport it by water uh,
Mhm.
down a creek or a river to do most of the work and then pick it up. So
Wow. This
yeah.
is, I mean, we could just stay on this topic alone, but I have a bunch
Yeah.
of questions. I'm going to switch a little bit to ask you about the non-human world. How do
Mhm.
you, in your interviewing practice, have you developed techniques or research to capture the agency and presence of the non-human world? And
Mhm.
I asked this specifically because I went to a conference recently and I met some folks who were developing an oral history project to interview cows.
Oh,
So, so people really
okay.
are thinking about like how do we interview? And there's also a book called The Life of Trees.
Yes.
Um, so
Okay.
how have
So
you encompass this? And yeah.
that's really it. I'd like to know more about the cow thing if you could send me the link.
Okay.
I would say that most of my approach okay, I have a few thoughts. And a lot of this was actually um I learned a lot of this in doing in Canada what we have called traditional land use studies. And so I will give you just a really quick understanding of what that is so that you can kind of envision this. But in Canada, we have a law um, uh, that came out of a case called Delgamuch in British Columbia. And that law, to distill it to a very sort of like a point, which is it's very broad, but just to simplify it, um, it it basically enabled or gave legal acknowledgement to oral histories as a legal document. So previously to that, in our very colonial structure of what a historical document is, it was archival records that were printed. And this, as we know, just doesn't encapsulate indigenous populations and not only that, just like working class populations that might not be keeping sort of structured archival documents that are then kind of like accessioned somewhere and seen as like the historical record. And
Right.
so this case was amazing, and it basically said that moving forward, oral histories are seen as on par with archival documents that the government or that the crown may have produced. This
Wow.
was in the early 1990s. And what came out of that is that when the when industry wants to expand their projects across Canada, so whether that's a mine in Northern Ontario or a pipeline running from Alberta west to the coast, or that doesn't help you being American, but like a pipeline running from Montana through to Washington State,
Right. Yes.
um, or here it very well might be a mine in Cape Breton Island. You have to do due diligence to show that you have consulted historical documents. And that you have also consulted with Indigenous communities in Canada. And so that has actually created a bit of an ecosystem where oral histories are regularly collected by Indigenous communities. Often it is problematic that the fact that we're collecting those oral histories is under the sort of umbrella of resource extraction. That's kind of
Mhm.
like a
Yeah.
theme of Canadian history in
Yeah.
general. But it does mean that there's a consistent opportunity for people to share stories about how they have used the land. And the idea behind that is like if we're going to disturb your land, we want to understand how it has been used in
Mm.
not just how you used it, but your great grandparent, within living memory, so that we can get a better sense of what species might be there that we might be disturbing, what we might come across that, in terms of archaeological sites that we're going to have to move around. And so I worked on my first traditional land use study in 2017, 2018. And at that point, I really was learning not just how to sit down and do an oral history with someone, but how to use maps. So we would bring maps up and we'd put them on screens and we'd have them on tables and we would talk to elders and knowledge keepers and have them kind of point out like, here is where we would start and here is where we might end up on a day, spending day on the land. And this is where berries might be, and this is where bears might den, and this is where deer might cross. And here's how we've seen that change over time. So my first kind of introduction to this sort of how are you dealing with like the non-human world in your interviews was through maps. And
Mhm.
then, that project was quite special, just due to the sort of team that we had together. And we immediately just started doing almost all of the interviews on the land itself. So a lot of oral history interviews, some of you might know, are quite planned, like you might be in somebody's home, you might be in an office that you've set up as a neutral space. You might be in a boardroom where you're able to kind of set up your maps on the wall, even or on the table. And we realized that we were going to get deeper, more interesting, more fruitful memories and stories by meeting people at our office and being like, getting in the truck together. And we would set up at that point those road mics that people can get now that clip. Those are amazing. At that point, we actually didn't really have that, so we'd try to set up these lavalier mics with their cords everywhere, and like and one of us would drive, and usually the elder would be in the front seat with us, and we would just pull to the road wherever they wanted to stop and get out and walk around. And sometimes we did picking, or sometimes they showed us where they got their first kill of a deer, and like important spiritual sites. And that was sort of changed how I thought we could do oral history interviews. Actually, I think if you had asked me before that point, I would have thought that most of my interviewees might not have physically wanted to do that,
Mhm.
because we interview a lot of older people, and I would have perhaps assumed that it would be more comfortable to be sort of in a room with tea. And basically, none of the elders that we interviewed, when we gave them the option to do it in the room, wanted to do that. They were like, "No,
Let's
like,
go.
even if we're in the car, that's better."
That's
And
really
we got to real
fascinating.
understanding also of like the dips of the hills. So there were some really interesting kind of things that came out of that I didn't quite expect, which is like looking at a map, you can say, oh, well, we hunted around this area. But once they started saying, okay, so do you see how that hill kind of dips down there? And I have a memory of like tripping there when my uncle took me out, and then it being a bit of a lesson. Or like, do you see how like it curves here? So that's where we might hide or spend the night. So there was just a much deeper understanding. I, with Tree Thieves, I did do a fair bit of that. But actually, what was different about that, which I think is quite notable, is that there were only so many places we could go because it was a park. And we had to stick to the trails, and we couldn't really, actually, for quite a few of those people, they were not allowed in the park anymore. So I couldn't do the land-based interview in that way. I could often do it in their yards or like ask about where their family lived. But you were quite constrained with the rules of the park. So I got a real sense of almost how they maybe felt a little bit
Mhm.
in that way.
Mhm.
Um, and then also, so for Tree Thieves, I also did interviews in Peru. And that was because, I mean, you can't really talk about illegal logging in North America without talking about the fact that it happens on a much bigger scale in the global south. And for that, that was entirely land-based. Like that was just spending all day interview, like microphone and notepad in one hand, and then using a GPS device in another to sort of map out where theft was taking place.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, um, so in a way, human beings and maps served as interlocutors, but then when you were able to travel to the spaces on those maps, seeing the different topography allowed for the land to speak, the non-human, the rock,
Yeah.
the levee, the river to
Yeah.
tell you, to show you what this
Yeah.
space craved or how it had changed.
Yeah. And I think what's when we're talking about that, and I'm just mentioning the park, and with the caveat that I love national like I'm very, Redwoods is this amazing place that we have that would not stand there anymore if it was not for the park, because it would have been logged.
Mhm.
But the fact that we were constrained, I think that was a really important sort of interviewing method and
Mhm.
feeling that I had to
Mhm.
feel in order to understand and write this book, by being there with someone that could then say, well, we would go over there. Of course, we're not allowed to do that anymore. Or like, this is where my dad showed me how to do this. And I remember that this is where we would turn off and go up the hill, but I can't show you. And that was important for me to experience, even if I did disagree with almost the entire philosophy around it their broader point, if that made sense. Was that
And
sort
they
of sadness of like, and here was a piece of land that had been, of course, allowed in the intervening 40 years to grow wild and to be kind of way more biodiverse and in many cases, I think, a sort of happier, more well-rounded ecosystem. But if you consider humans as part of that ecosystem, I don't know. I don't think that our human element of it was allowed to progress in the same way.
what did they mean when they said that they couldn't show you
Because they can't step off the trail.
and anymore?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I also wanted to ask you on that theme, how did you navigate when there are stories that people want to share but don't want to make public? They want to share with you, they may have developed a relationship with you, but that there's still something that just belongs to that community.
And in the context of the land use or in the context of the book, because they're very different.
Both, I think.
I mean, in the context of the land use studies, those are like highly managed. We really expected that to happen a lot. We had very sort of when they signed their consent form, it was like incredibly clear. If you want to share something with me that you don't want to share with in the record, you just tell me. And like off goes the recording, you know? And even if I think it's an amazing story, I kind of understand the desire to maybe not have that recorded, or that you're sharing this with me as a gift and not as a gift to the eventual archive that this is going to end up in. I understood that. The intersubjectivity, I guess, if we want to use that like academic term of me reporting on my book and doing oral history for my book, that was very different because I knew that I was communicating this to a general audience. I knew that this was going to be likely a book that was reviewed places. And so not only was I writing this for readers, but I was also writing it for that it would be distilled in other forms that I had no control over. And I knew that I wanted to tell the story in the more complete way that I felt I really wanted to communicate that to my narrators in the hopes that they would allow me to share that. And things became a little bit complicated. Like there are things that were told to me with my recorder off that I wish had been told to me with my recorder on, but my ethics, I wasn't going to put, there were a few instances where I did go back and say, you shared this with me and I want to confirm that you still don't want me to include that, which I think is like a nice broad way, but also me being like, please say you've thought twice, because but like no, and in both cases it didn't, they were like no, and I respected that. But like I hope you might, yeah, I'm wondering if you might understand what I mean by like having that like consent form in between us in many ways was like very black and white for everybody. Whereas like I understood what I could do and I knew the limitations and they understood what they could do and the limitations. But with this sort of more fluid thing with a book, it wasn't as clear. I could have, I did not have, for instance, consent forms for this book, but I did do oral history interviews. And because of that, like, those transcripts and those recordings are not going to be accessioned anywhere. They're going to live with me. So, yeah. What do you think? I'd like to know what you think of that. Because, like, I waver on if I should have, to be honest. It's not very journalistic to have consent forms, and I was operating between the two worlds,
I think you are asking someone who questions the use of consent forms.
Yeah. They're
for
like
reasons. I I mean, documents can be a violence to many people,
Yes,
especially if
yeah,
they've been disenfranchised by contract work and
yeah,
documentation.
yeah.
And so in my experience doing oral histories, I've worked with people who have experienced that
Mm-hmm.
extraction and violence through documents. And so many, if I had offered a consent form, they would have been offended and
Yes,
probably not talked to me.
yeah.
So
Yes,
in,
and in the land use study, it's so interesting. So you can have an amazing conversation with someone, and then the minute you're like, okay, before we get started, I need you to sign this. And
Mhm.
to me, I see that consent form as a protection for them, actually.
Right.
But they don't, they see that as a protection against them a lot
Yeah.
of times. At the same time, a lot of people really want that consent form because
Yeah.
it's like,
It's
I,
proof.
it's
It's a paper
proof.
document. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's very complicated, I think.
I have a collection of consent forms because I like to see what people have, and
Yeah,
I find that almost 90%, 95% of them protect the
yeah,
institution.
yeah,
And so I think there's a real conversation to be had about how do we
yeah.
do oral histories that protects also the narrator, not just the institution. And I think there's more happening. And I think this conversation with you is definitely going to contribute to that conversation.
I mean, I could go, I could, we could talk about consent forms as a whole other session because
Yes.
like, anyway, I don't want to off-rail the convo, but I
No,
have a lot of examples of sort of like,
super
there's also some
interesting,
interesting things of
relevant.
like, when you do a land use study, this is technically about land use. We don't, it's also about everything. Like,
Yeah.
and just to kind of come back to the focus of this, we start off talking about where do you go fishing, and then you very quickly are hearing about like family histories of trauma, histories of when someone has had like you were just saying like violence perpetrated against them that in many ways you're like, oh, you could that's severely against the law. So you've
Hmm.
already now you've recorded something in the context of a land use study that is like could be used in ways that are not in that context whatsoever.
Hmm.
And they wanted to share that with you, and that's amazing. And you're also thinking, oh my God, like, how do we protect this now? Do we protect it?
Yeah.
I'm not the right person to decide that. Because if they wanted to share it, maybe they don't want it to be protected,
Yeah.
you know? So it's very, how do you encompass that in one document where you're saying like, okay, sign your name here is pretty intense.
In some ways, Lyndsie, um, oral history has so many parameters that restrict the
Yep.
way people show up and the kinds of stories they share versus journalism or other forms of story gathering that is
Mm,
more free flowing, like you said, like your
hmm.
journalism work, you don't do consent forms, you just ask for consent verbally,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
Um, and so, what do you think, as someone who does both?
Hmm.
What do the two have to learn from each other, and how do we
Yeah.
continue to have that, promote that conversation for oral
Yeah.
history to speak to journalism and to meld when to switch, I guess, when the narrator really needs more
Yeah.
journalistic approach than an oral history approach?
And but can I also flip it the other way first and
Yes.
tell you a story, which is like when I first started doing tree thieves, um, I approached it with my oral historian hat on in terms of the poachers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because I felt that every time a news story came up, there would be a breaking news story and it would say like a poacher did not respond to comment or whatever. And I knew from my journalistic background that that's because the way that they were approached was likely quite aggressive or at least assertive and with a sort of like I have this deadline in mind and I need you to call me back right now and I'm going to ask you 4 or 5 very pointed questions that are probably going to make you look really bad. And I wanted to, when I approached this, the first thing I did was tell all of them that I wanted to do a life history interview about their family. And
Mm-hmm.
every single person said yes because they wanted to share with me about their interesting, unique, loved family. And that's what we did. So we would first do often like a couple interviews of me interviewing just like classic oral history interview, history from below about everyday people. So
Mhm.
it would be like, who are you are Danny Garcia. Who's your dad? Who was your dad's dad? Who was
Yeah.
your dad's dad's dad? Tell me
Mm.
about them. And everyone was just like so, and it wasn't a put on for me. I genuinely wanted to hear it. And then hours later, we finally got to like, okay, and this is where you started maybe to think about taking a tree. And I
Mm.
think that that is something that I hope to instill in other journalists.
Yes, please.
So all of that aside, like that was my approach, and I think that it worked out quite well. And I think that it helped people feel seen in a way that perhaps the media often doesn't make people feel seen. Because
Mhm.
I didn't want it, it is by nature extractive, but I didn't want it to be quickly extractive. I wanted it
Mhm.
to feel like more of a slow kind of consensual process.
Mhm.
Um, I don't think it was perfect
Mhm.
in any means. But I do think that when the book came out, there were very few, there wasn't almost any feedback from poachers feeling that I had gotten it wrong. And
Oh, that's
that's,
great.
mhm. And I afforded the same opportunity to every ranger and almost everyone except for if I was just getting very quick facts from
Mhm.
people. So I did with the rangers, I did life history interviews with them, and then I got to the poaching. Um, but most journalists do not have that time. I recognize that. Um,
Time or finances, right? It
oh
takes
yeah. Yeah.
the time means finances.
Yeah. Yeah. No, they have jobs. Like they can't, and I was sort of blessed in this way. Then it also happened during COVID. So I had my book project during COVID. Everyone was at home. So like sometimes I would just phone up people and we all kind of had a bit more time to like hang around and chat on the phone. So it was like a very different thing. But so you had asked me how the two can learn from each other. I think that oral history, and I often say this, can learn the thing that I has benefited me is that journalism, I'm not afraid to go up to people. I'm
Mhm.
not afraid to ask them. And when I've talked to a lot of oral historians, sometimes they get a little bit in their head about like, they're going to think this about me, or I shouldn't do this because I don't identify with the community in one way or another. And I'm really sensitive to that. I get that. But I also think it might stop people sometimes from just me saying, but have you asked?
Mhm.
And journalism has given me a little bit of a tough skin of like when people say no, I just say okay and move on, and I don't really dwell too much in it. I hope I take away lessons where I need to, but I think that sort of um, I think the requesting is a big part of that, and also I think communicating and like what we do with those interviews. I think oral history is often at a crossroads with that. Where do these end up?
Mhm.
How are we editing them? That's like the
Mhm.
scariest thing, right? We would prefer to keep these interviews as these intact, like 2 hour experiences, because it feels really bad sometimes to sort of say that's the good quote and that's the bad quote and like take it and put it in all these in different ways. But um, I think
Yeah.
I think accepting that it's kind of that's inherently kind of part of the process and it will never feel good, but what's good is sharing and
Mhm.
listening. I think that that's
Mhm.
what I would hope. I would hope that some oral historians kind of might learn a little bit to,
Mhm.
because we hear so much important stuff, and
Mhm.
there is an assumption that sometimes we want to safeguard it and keep it safe and like all the time. Um, but access might be more of a good thing.
Mhm.
There's some overlaps there with the forest, right? Where I'm saying like, oh, we kept the redwoods safe, and what happened with that is that like they're not touched, and people feel very disconnected, and they feel a lot of sort of they feel that they are being separated from the environment. And it's the same with sort of
Mhm.
like the stories and the listening and
Mhm.
actually putting them out there to the public.
Mhm.
I go back and forth. I really do. I think when you're in this, I think when you're like in the thick of doing these interviews and you're like you don't want to misrepresent it and it can feel very tempting to just say that I have done it and it lives and it's recorded. But
Yeah.
what do we do with it then after, Like what's the point?
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
don't know.
It sounds like more oral historians should look into doing journalism,
Yeah.
and journalists should look into doing more
Just
oral
calm down
history.
a little. No,
Yeah,
but I work with journalists and they don't like to hear that. So
I'm sure, yes.
some of them really do. But I think also our systems are changing. Like journalism as an
Yeah.
ecosystem is changing rapidly. And so that speed actually has sort of, in a lot of cases, like ebbed away.
Hmm.
Because with the internet, you're not like betrothed every day to having this story done by 3 p.m.
Yeah. I just read an
I'm going against a lot of what I teach, so I won't share the link because, like,
no, please
I
do.
know
You're
I will.
welcome to share any. I have a couple more questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. We're going until 6:30 today, right, Ella? Or 6:15 or Eastern.
I
Mhm.
think 6:15. We can also,
Okay.
yeah, if people get to 6:15. I don't know if Lyndsie has to leave
I
at.
can stay till it would be 7:30 for me, 6:30 for
Yeah, I think
Fanny.
we're going until 6:15. So
Yes.
we have
Okay,
or
perfect. Um, I wanted to ask you about like all these different spaces that you have traveled to, the
Mhm.
Shetlands, the Peruvian Amazon, and how you document how place shapes people and their
Mhm.
relationship with the land and the environment. I'm curious if you've seen much difference, or is it pretty
I think
similar,
I see more things in common.
more things in common? Tell us
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, I think yeah, there's a point in my book where I'm in Peru and I'm going to this site where people have been poaching trees. Chihuahuaco was the name of the species, and the landowners that were having this poaching take place, they graciously took me out. And when I got there, I was like, this looks like British Columbia. Like, this looks like Northern California where people set up with tarps and tents, and um, their their equipment is kind of scattered all over, and like they're squatting on this land, and it looked just like when like in the Pacific Northwest, like there's housing issues. And like there are increasingly numbers of people like living on public lands, like living rough, sleeping rough. The same in New Brun or Nova Scotia. And so it looked the same
Mm.
to me. It legitimately, I was like, I had been to a poaching site in British Columbia that looked like the exact same kind of tent, the exact same tarps, the exact same chucking up of the wood. And the reasons were the same.
Mm.
So, um,
What
poachers
was
and
different? The stories that were shared about the
the
space?
context of it was slightly different. So, most poachers in North America are white. Or at least in that context, there is a strong tradition of indigenous poaching that really complicates that narrative a little bit. But the tree poaching from the parks, the records show majority Caucasian identifying males. And in Peru, what was, I think, interesting was that they were often economic migrants. And so these were not sort of locals poaching wood. It was folks that were often coming from Venezuela or other countries that had been sort of uh, incentivized to leave and to
Mhm.
look for work in other countries, and essentially kind of landing in Peru. They don't know the country. They're unfamiliar with the laws, and companies there take advantage of that, and they say, if you can find a place to stay, I'll buy the wood off you under the table, and it'll help you get kind of solidified in a new community really quickly. And this must be, a really scary thing. And again, I came away from it being like, well, wouldn't you? Like, if I had arrived in the jungles of Peru and I knew how to use a chainsaw, and this guy's saying to me, listen, like, I'll give you X number of Peruvian soles for work, and you might not even know that that's
Okay.
illegal land. Like in a lot of cases, like they've just been straight up lied to and said, yeah, you're totally free and you can camp wherever you want. Um, it kind of pissed me off that they had been charged with poaching in that way, because just the context around it was completely
Mm.
unfair.
Mhm, mhm.
Mhm. So, whereas the poachers in North America knew what they were doing. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That is super helpful.
Hmm.
We're coming up on the hour, and I think we
Okay.
can open it up here for, is there anything that I haven't asked you, Lyndsie, that you would like to share about either your work, your book, what you're working on next?
Oh, yeah. The famous
Yes.
question. I'm working on a few things. One is not as much oral history related because there's a language barrier. And so I wouldn't want to be the one doing the interviews for that. But I'm the very final chapter of Tree Thieves talked about sort of not alternative, but land management structure that might be more inclusive, particularly to working class communities, communities that are going through deindustrialization. And I really dug into the community forest method. Community forests are flawed in many ways. Poaching still takes place in community forests, but the difference there is that those forests are run by neighbors of the people that are doing the poaching, and they are free to work outside of a law enforcement structure in the sense that one forest manager shared with me, I thought I knew who was doing it. I went to his house. I said, "Hey man, why are you doing this?" He shared with me that he needed firewood, and he's now like a volunteer at the community forest, and he gets essentially paid in firewood. And I really liked this kind of like very, very local solution. And so across the world, there are some laws in Scotland that actually make community land ownership much more of a feasible prospect. So I've been doing some research into a book about how community land in Scotland has worked and how it might be applied to other places around the world. It's not to get too into it, but their community land laws are very vocally developed as an anti-colonial response to like English land ownership in Scotland over like, hundreds and hundreds of centuries. And when Scotland gained devolution in 1999, part of that was like, we want our land back, and this is how we're going to do it. And they've been slowly ticking away. And you get some very interesting, wacky stories of sort of entire communities buying back the land on which they live from like wealthy aristocrats.
Hmm. I
Yeah.
think I've heard about this. I'm so excited to read.
I think there's a lot to be said. So, yeah.
Um, well, Ella, I'm going to pass it over to you, and I think we can open up the Q&A to the audience with any questions that they might have. Lyndsie, this conversation has been super
Was
enlightening.
it good? Okay.
Yes.
Bring back the comments. That's right, Kate. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't work perfectly, which is also why I like it. I think sometimes the marketing around like national parks and stuff like that can be quite idyllic, where it's sort of like, we're going to take this out of use and we're going to preserve this beautiful view. And it gives us a very sort of idealistic way of looking at nature. And community land ownership is like not perfect at all. And the people that do that will tell you. And I think it's kind of refreshing how they'll be like, oh yeah, like it hasn't worked out in every way like we've wanted it to.
Mhm.
I was thinking maybe as people are thinking of questions or typing in the chat, I can share the pictures that you
Oh, sure. Yeah, I totally forgot that I submitted.
can people see these. Yeah.
So this is archival research that I was doing as part of a land use study. Land use studies, I think, are just so interesting. We could do a whole other chat on those and the ways in which they're flawed and also like really beautiful. And when we were one story I wanted to share, Fanny, when we were talking about consent forms and then land use is that the first land use study that I was a part of, it was seemingly this sort of straightforward project where I was interviewing, we had to interview 100 people in X period of time, and we created these maps and we showed a real kind of consistent land use between like the mid 19th century all the way through 2017. And we really were able to show that, like, should this project go through, almost the entire traditional territory of this community was going to be impacted by it. And they would not be able to access sort of like the access to clean water would be impacted, their access to like unpolluted berries. It was severely going to be impacted because there would be all this air pollution and the berries would just be whatever,
Mhm.
and noise was going to make the deer migrate north. And then what actually ended up happening was the place that the community had arranged for us to do the interviews was a, a band owned, which in Canada we would say band council. I think you guys would say tribal council. It's just a semantics different. So it was a tribal council owned building that was actually a boarding school in through the 19th and 20th century. And so what ended up happening was, of course, we would invite people to come share these stories, and they would be sharing these stories in this place of immense trauma where they had been forced away from their family. And a lot of people were very keen to come in there, but we ended up recording just hours of oral histories about that place, about
Mm.
that building and what had happened in it. And that was okay, and we were glad to do it, and they were not, part of our report into the environment. Um, but if when things have come up about that location, about that school, we know as the project holders that there are stories about that school that are held in files that are labeled environmental study. And I just think,
Mm.
nobody knows that these are in there. They were gathered under the context, and the consent form was the context of environment.
Mhm.
Um, but
Wow.
all this truth is kind of held outside of it. And I just think that that's like a limitation of interviewing in oral history that I don't know the way around, you
Yeah.
know?
Mhm.
And I've been thinking a lot about it because I'm like, well, we gathered the consent for on this topic in this context, and it still stands. But
It could
we
be
have
used for something.
files of hours and hours of just stories that nobody would know to look there for them,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know?
Mhm. Wow. And then what were you looking at in this section? Is this like one of the families in the
Yep.
archive that you were looking at?
Yeah, so that I think that would be diary entries, and like you can see that there are some crosses. And so this would have been related to the locations of burial sites,
Mm.
most likely, because those are included in land use studies. Because obviously, people that do development, they want to know
Yeah,
if they're going to come up against something, which they almost always are. So
definitely.
yeah. And then
And
this is in Peru when I was talking about the timber poaching there. I mean, it was wild. I mean, if you look at this, like those poachers were processing the wood there. So there was a mill set up, and they've like made these like almost like perfect
yeah.
blocks that they were able to transport to the market. And yeah, we were doing a land interview. So, this fellow Jorge was like walking around with his machete. It's like it felt very comfortable, I would say, and it felt very natural that would be how he would be spending time on the land. And very different way to hear about somebody's family, I think, is standing in this environment.
And did you record on a cell phone or a small
If you
recorder?
go back, yeah, you can see I think I might have it in here with me. I just have like a little, at this point, like a little Olympus,
Yeah,
whatever. It's not the best. But you
cool.
guys know, it's like wood that I had sort of the funds at that point to like get
Yeah,
myself a nice Zoom setup with like a boom mic with a cover on it. But the other thing is that this is quite an unobtrusive
hmm.
thing. So I
You
kind
can
of go
barely
back and
see
forth
it.
on these
Yeah,
beautiful setups because I'm like, they're very aware. And in oral history, you want them to be kind of aware the whole time that they're being recorded, but also not aware.
yeah,
The consent thing is so tricky in that
yes.
way. So I like this because people would forget that I was holding it, you know?
And you're not even that close to him. You're kind of
No, oh no, it picked it up really well. Yeah.
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 I wonder,
So the Olympus, you know, if anyone's on the market, the Olympus
yes.
recorder is a pretty good one.
Um, do you often listen to recordings and pick up the sound of the environment? What does that add to?
All of these recordings are the natural sounds behind it are wild. And then I also I would record at night because we were, so it was me and my translator named Milton, and we camped, like we stayed in the communities that welcomed us. And so I made a lot of nature recordings on our hikes and then on before bed because it was so loud. And then I would listen to them back when I was recording just to remember just the
place.
biodiversity. Like I just think that we've forgotten. We don't know here actually
Yeah.
how loud it can be. And
Yeah.
it's like a cacophony. It's like those are not quiet places in the way that we think that nature should be still and serene.
Yeah,
It's
the
not.
pastoral does not apply here.
No, and it probably shouldn't apply here either.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah,
Yeah, we've been deprived of that for sure.
I think so. The birds. Yeah. And
Oh,
then this is Shetland. So, when I was in Shetland, I was interviewing the final generation. So British British companies were whaling in Antarctica up until 1963, which I think is relatively recent in terms of what people might think of as whaling. And the vast majority of whalers came from the Shetland Islands, and that is for a number of reasons. The first being that historically they are seafaring folk
mm,
and they whaled. Like Orkney and the Shetlands, like they were traditional whalers up until like the English invasion and the clearances, basically, which took them away from the water. And so they have this like very strong passed down cultural identity and like particularly male identity with being out on the water and hunting whales for their
mm,
oil and rendering whales for their oil. And so when the UK had this kind of bustling whaling economy in the Atlantic, or sorry, the Southern Antarctic, the company people would go to Shetland and recruit them. Just like they would show up, and it would be usually like every September, and they would say, "Who's going to come?" And they would just kind of stand there with a list and check them off, and they'd be like, "Your boat will be here on whatever day." Um, and it's coming from Norway because the Norwegians were also, it would be like 50% Shetland, 50% Norwegian. And they would sail down to Antarctica. And so the final kind of surviving generation of those whalers still lives in Shetland. That's where they would return when their ships were done. And they would work the land. So it was interesting that whaling profits and the whaling economy was actually supporting the traditional farming economy in Shetland, because that economy had been through sort of English rule had essentially been depleted due to policy decisions that families couldn't self-sustain based on farming alone.
mm,
That the men would go to Antarctica and go whaling and bring back those profits and run the farm until they went back whaling again. So there was a cycle of
mm.
it. And so this is Shetland, and this is somebody's farm in Shetland that was essentially maintained through their life and their father's life through whaling.
Wow.
So I thought it was very interesting that they saw whaling as being very connected to land and not to sea.
Hmm.
Like they were saying, actually, the whaling enables us to stay where we want to stay.
Hmm.
Which is very similar to the economy where I live, where many, many people cannot earn enough money through fishing or farming here anymore that they go work the oil patch in a different part of the country and come back. I think that there's some parallels there over time. Yeah.
I guess they had to once they caught a whale, bring it onto land to
Yeah. So
break
they
it.
had there's a small island there called South Georgia. And the companies, the English companies built factories down there. They are still there and they've been abandoned for 60 years almost or more, and they are rusting and slowly being demolished by weather and contaminating the earth
Mm.
because we have left factories built with lead and arsenic and all these bad things that aren't legal anymore to just, yeah, dissolve. So, yeah, they had huge communities essentially built down there that people would stay in. Like you wouldn't live on the boat necessarily. You would live in this kind of factory, depending on what your job was in the barracks. And whales would be caught out to sea and towed in, and everyone would sort of bring them in and start rendering them and flensing them and things like that. So
One
called
of my
Leith Harbor.
Lee Harbor,
Leith, yeah.
Leith.
Yeah.
One of my last questions for you, Lyndsie, was going to be about how do we contend with this, what you just described, the aftermath of an industry and how
Mhm.
it's seeping into the soil and harming the
Mhm.
present, um, you know, um,
And can I also make a parallel too? So the aftermath of industry, particularly in redwoods, is that it has been the public idea of leadership and conservation has also been essentially damaged by how that process came about. So you have environmental damage in terms of, yeah, you have old factories just abandoned because they have no, no incentive to clean up the earth. And then you also have the mindset of people that have been, in one way or another, really disenfranchised from that decision-making process, and therefore their anger has been targeted onto conservation groups in particular or government in particular. And I think it's only going to become more prevalent. I'm very concerned about this in general. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to be going through, for instance, successfully or not, as we're seeing now, a sort of pivot away from oil and gas or a pivot away from coal. And I think we can see how humans have been forgotten in that. And I think that when we talk about things like a just transition, I think those are some words that are thrown around a lot now. I'm very interested in how oral history can be a part of a just transition by giving people the capacity to share memory in order to feel that they've been heard and to feel that their identity has been respected and that their work, even though we are moving away from it now and we might see it now as the moral complexity of it has changed, that our acceptance of them as workers has not changed. And that we
yeah.
still don't blame them for the fact that corporations have essentially over extracted and demolished an entire way of life. But we have not always done that very well in the past. We didn't do it well with whalers who felt that they were being attacked as being like heartless and,
Mm-hmm.
how could
Mm-hmm.
you kill a whale? What's wrong
Mm-hmm.
with you? You're the devil. Like they would hear stuff like that for sure all the time in the media. And at the same time, the poachers would hear, they lived through a time called the Timber Wars when you had just really nasty rhetoric back and forth of like, people like a lot of environmental activists would say really quite cruel things about their way of life and about their families. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and they directed their ire not always at the corporation, but at the worker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what we have now is what ends up happening when
Mm-hmm.
that happens, which is like hatred between people that could actually work together. And so when we're talking about just transition, I think that listening is a really big part of that. And I think I don't, if I'm having a good day, I think I hope that people will get on board. If I'm having a bad day, I'm like, oh, nobody, we're not learning, we're gonna shut this down. And people will say that oil and gas has been disrespected and all of this. And I think there's room for that. I don't know what you think, but when I'm thinking about the whalers and the loggers, they have that in common where they feel that they were maligned when their bosses should have been.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't disagree because they're also the bosses got to leave those communities when
Yeah.
their mills shut down. So
And not have accountability.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And they also don't have to live with the polluted water and they don't have to live with the polluted
Mm-hmm.
soil and they don't have to live in a house that's falling apart and you can't afford to fix it. And
Mm-hmm.
on and on.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you, Lyndsie, so much for this
thanks.
enriching conversation. Learned a lot. Many of the people in the comments have said the same. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for coming.
And Ella, I'll let you close us out.
Yeah,
Mhm.
thank you so much, Lyndsie, for like I was taking notes with different things you were saying that I think are so inspiring for like, getting to like learning about how we understand nature and non-human life and how it intersects with oral history. And also, yeah, like other things like even if you're not doing specifically like environmentally focused oral history, but like how do we I wrote down like, but have you asked? Like such great advice
Yeah, but
for
have you asked? Yeah.
storytelling that we want to engage with. So thank you so
Mhm.
much, Lyndsie. Thank you,
Thanks.
Fanny, for a great conversation. Yeah, for folks, I hope you'll continue to check out our storytelling in practice series. I'm gonna put a link in the chat here. Oh, that's Lyndsie's website, which I'll just plug in one more time. And then
Oh, that's nice.
the storytelling practice series. So we have 2 sessions coming up in December that are going to be awesome. We hope
Yeah.
folks will, reach out to us if you want to partner.
Mhm.
If you're able to consider, contributing and donating to Voice of Witness to support our work. It really does make a difference, especially right now and the current nonprofit landscape. And you can reach out to me or Fanny with any questions. My email is there. But otherwise, thank you so much, Lyndsie. Thank you, Fanny. Thank you, everyone who's been
Thank you, Bella.
listening. Whether you're listening live or on the recording, we appreciate you tuning in and being part of this. So thank you all so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And much to come, much more exciting things to come on the vow front. So
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lyndsie. Have a